Ibrahim, welcome. Now, you had the keynote speaker slot at this year's ACI Europe Commercial and Retail Conference. Now, I know you do a lot of these speeches everywhere in the world, but today's was different.
It's not different in as much as it's a keynote, but it's different in as much as it's very close to my heart and to our business's heart. Many of the conference keynotes I do and my colleagues do, I mean, we're not in the public speaking business. Yes, of course, they're to promote our business, but not to promote what we do. It's promote our thinking and our opinion.
It's certainly in demand, Ibrahim.
Yeah, it's very in demand. Thank you. And so we see ourselves as not part of the design industry, not part of the architecture industry. We see ourselves as part of the aviation industry. We are part of that community. We've been so for 30 years, and that's why it's different. Because it's important to us. It's critical. And we care a lot about the impact of what we say and what the industry is doing and our colleagues and our friends in the industry. So, yeah, it is a bit different. Emotionally, it's quite different, actually.
And let's just drill down to today's speech. I mean, what was different about that?
It was different from previous keynotes I've done, in as much as it focused a little bit more on what drives the behaviour and expectations and mindset of our audience and the transumer, the travelling consumer, as we refer to them, and not so much just as a traveller, but as a consumer, not within the travel environment, outside. What is driving their behaviour from a cultural, social point of view, and that bigger picture kind of thinking, and I referred to it as the 10 traits, I think is the bedrock of how we kind of develop experiences. If we can respond to those 10 traits, I think we'll be doing something right.
We haven't got time to identify those 10 traits. People can look at the book for that. But in your book, Future Ready Retail, you say that innovation isn't a thing you do, it's the way you are. How can airports and travel retailers cultivate this innovation mindset effectively into their respective organisations?
Absolutely. It's not a job description, it's a culture, and it's a culture of test. As I say, do and learn, don't wait and see. We live in a very fast-moving landscape in retail, in airports, in consumer expectations, and therefore do and learn, don't wait and see. If you want to be 100% sure, you'll be 100% late. So that's what I mean by innovation culture. Test ideas discreetly, fail successfully, and move on. And I think that should permeate through the whole organisation, an innovation mindset, definitely.
Now, in our previous conversations, you've said that airports can become powerful media platforms for brands. I mean, what is required in terms of design, tech and revenue models for this to become a reality?
It's a very interesting question, Peter, and I majored on it in the keynote this morning. As I said in the presentation, retail is and always has been and will continue to be about 4 things: recruitment, transaction, fulfillment and retention. What's interesting is that transaction and fulfillment is, over time, migrating increasingly online, particularly in certain categories. And that, airports are not immune to that, as we can see. And I think increasingly, we're going to see physical space being used for recruitment and retention of customers. And in the presentation, I was generalising, and I was being a little bit provocative, as one does in a keynote. But I think there's a truism to that. And in any given airport, in any given shopping centre, I don't know whether of the GLA, the gross leasable area, how much of it is going to be transactional and fulfillment, and how much of it will be recruitment and retention. But what we do know is that there will be a proportion. Is it 10%? Is it 50%? We don't know. So if we agree on that, as I said in the keynote, then there's a proportion of the physical space will behave like a media platform. That changes the game. And to answer your question directly, it changes the design of the space, it changes the master planning of the terminal in respect of the space, it changes the kind of technology one will use, whether it's stages, lighting, sensory experiences, it changes the service proposition, no longer about selling product as such, it changes the experience, definitely. It changes the technology, as I say, it changes, most importantly, the revenue model, because the revenue model can't be based on a turnover rent. It's got to be based on something around, and I can't be specific about this necessarily, it's not my area of expertise, but what we're thinking, it begins to determine a revenue model based on the ability of a physical space and the experience within it to drive media impressions. And therefore the revenue model will be based on the ability to capture the media impressions and put a value on. In other words, capture the data that suggests that if anyone visits this experience, whether they've tweeted, photographed, shared, commented, how do we understand that that media impression, that comment, if you like, or the share, is attributable to that experience? And how do we value it? If a brand takes a space, and that brand, in an airport, and that brand pays on average 8 cents for a Facebook click, how much is it willing to pay for half an hour, 40 minutes, 1 hour of undivided attention from one of its fans or from a prospective fan? And I use the word fan, and I used it in the presentation this morning, purposely, because the holy grail of all brand, of all experience, is fandom. And that transcends transactional relationships. It delves into and it creates this idea of an emotional connection to a brand and therefore to an airport.
But you know how risk averse airports and retailers alike are, and you know all about the current business model that exists. I still quite like, and I think there's a greater opportunity when we look at some of the joint ventures that are out there at the moment, where the risk and reward is shared by both airport and retailer. Lagardère Travel Retail and Airports Paris is a very good example of that. But, where's the evidence of where you're saying the business should be going? Where's the evidence?
The evidence of the idea of a media platform.
Yeah.
This is very nascent. I can't point to lots and lots of specific examples. In my presentation, I gave one example, not in an airport, in a domestic market.
Let's hear it.
Sorry?
Let's hear it.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but the numbers were in the presentation. But it was an example of Converse, the brand, and how they created an activation which was all about recruitment and retention. There was some sales there, but it was very, very minor, and it was over a 4-day period. And they attracted, I think the number was, and you can look back at the video, 227 million media impressions.
That's extraordinary.
In 4 days.
Extraordinary.
And they attracted 40,000 Instagram followers in that 4 days.
And how many of them become fans and have that loyalty factor embedded?
But the key question is, how did Converse pay for that space? They paid it as a square meterage. Did they pay for it in terms of the value, the 227 million impressions it gave to the brand? And going back to your point about risk averse, I don't see that as pejorative. I don't criticise whether it's shopping centres or airports in being risk averse. Of course, this is a commercial world. As I say, we are in the aviation industry. We get all that. We absolutely get it. We're not fluffy designers. We understand the commercial prerogatives. But the do-nothing strategy is not an option. We've got to think about this industry and the commercial experience and the passenger experience in this industry in the next decade and 20 years. We're working on greenfield airports, new airports that won't even appear for the next 7, 8, 10 years. So this is really important. And in the world of retail, 10 years is not a long time in terms of how things change over that period. So partly it's provocations, partly it's let's have a conversation. Absolutely get the commercial parameters. I absolutely get the risk that involved and the hesitancy. Yeah, totally. but we've got to try these ideas. And I'm not saying for 1 minute that we're not going to have shelves with whiskey and chocolates. Of course we are. We're always going to have that. But there's going to be a proportion of space that brands will want to take to recruit customers and drive them online or into their physical store to the domestic market. And I think that is very interesting.
So just developing this as an idea, how do you see the role of technology evolving in airport retail spaces to support this new vision of experiential and data-driven environments?
At different levels. I think at the immediate level, in terms of the physical space, I think there's an opportunity to introduce technologies to create stages. Whether that's technologies about being able to configure a space very quickly, whether that means moving and progressing from digital screens to digital environments, which are becoming more and more cost effective. I think that is one step in creating really, really immersive experiences. We're seeing in the culture market, really fantastic immersive experiences. One in London in King's Cross, we're seeing the global rollout of the Van Gogh and the Klimt exhibitions are all about immersive technologies and immersive environments. So I think that's going to find its way into retail, which is very interesting. I think the physicality of creating spaces that have got, as I say, stages and lighting and sound. So let's think about the future of, and I hesitate to call it a shop, the future of a physical space for a brand, less and less about boxes with shelves for sale and more about stages with stories to share. That's what I talk about in the presentation and in my book. One thing I should say, when we've developed the stage and the immersive environment, then the opportunity is to live stream that. Now, if we have the most fantastic experience that a given brand will deliver in an airport, because it's the airport that gives it its most global exposure, most of its investment in activations will happen in an airport. What an opportunity there is to live stream that to everybody out there, the fans out there that are not in the airport. I think that is an interesting future to explore. And then we could go into the technology of virtual reality, how we can then bring that into creating a much more deeper, magnified experience in the space. I think that's very interesting. And then the technology of data. We've been developing with a data partner a tool which we've been talking to a couple of airports about. And this is important, and I spoke about this briefly in the presentation. I didn't have time to get into it in detail, but I'd love to talk to other airports about this. And this is the tool, it's an AI-powered tool which maps social media and online engagement in any given geolocated, in any given location. Whether that's an airport, whether that's a store within an airport, whether that's a street, a shopping centre, whatever. And in mapping the social media and online engagement, it determines what people in that space are thinking, what their views are, what influencers they're following, their profile, where they eat, where they drink, but very importantly, not just what they do, but their sentiment, what they actually think. What the tool offers is basically millions and millions of secret shoppers to any retailer and any landlord.
I mean, it's a radical departure from what's out there.
Very radical departure, and it cracks the dilemma or the challenge of data. Now, once we understand how many Instagram posts there were, how many X comments there were, Twitter comments, how many shares there were, we can then begin to put a value on those. We know the metrics. Now the tool, we're using the tool, we're not using it in airports yet. We are speaking to 2 or 3 airports, and we're getting there slowly, but we're using it in a domestic market. For instance, Regent Street in London is all Regent Street. The Crown Estates use this tool to understand the sentiment of the customers in Regent Street, as well as many, many other developments across the UK and Europe.
It's pretty good
So
endorsement.
I think it's a very interesting opportunity for airports. We personally, as Portland, use the data to determine the type of activations, to determine the mix, the commercial mix, to determine the master plan, therefore, and to determine what changes we should make in the design or in the service proposition. Also, we use the data to determine the content of social media that we create in our marketing campaigns, and also the brand communication in our branding work. So for us, it's a very key tool, and it's the absolute essential piece of us developing what we have done, in as much as developing a evidence-based, outcome-driven design process. And that evidence base is very important. The data is only one part of the evidence. We have other buckets of evidence, let's say. We do, the normal focus groups and ethnography to have a deep dive into consumer behaviour and expectations. And we do a big trend piece, so we really understand the cultural and consumer trends that will drive behaviour. So along with all these different buckets of evidence and the data tool, we can really develop a key understanding, a deep understanding of our audience, which drives the insight from which drives the strategy and the design.
Let's just stay on airports. Are there special skills and expertise, do you think, that airport commercial teams need to develop some of these new concepts?
So as you may have noticed, Peter, in my I think, penultimate slide was titled The People Revolution. And this is critical because we can talk about lots of ideas, as we have a tendency to do, but it's how we deliver them. And if we accept that part of the commercial offer will be behaving like a media platform, I mentioned and I listed all the things that will change. Well, one of the most important things that will change is the kind of people, kind of skills that an airport will need to deliver that. So beyond, leasing boxes and property background, we need to have people and skills around storytelling, around data analytics, around stage management, editing, a whole bunch of skills that are required to deliver a media platform.
Most of that resource is not housed as we sit here in airports at the moment.
No, they don't, and that is not just in case of airports. Any business that owns and operates a shopping centre, very rarely do they have these skills, and certainly they're beginning to understand the importance of how do you put on a show as opposed to develop a shop. That is the difference. And I mean, one could argue that it's the brand that should have those skills, and a lot of the brands do, but also as an asset owner, an asset operator, in terms of an airport asset, that's also a kind of an important skill around curating that space, around understanding and moving beyond siloed categories, creating
Indeed.
a blended approach to curation, which can put on these shows, bringing brands together that really can create a great activation that can be live streamed and really reinvents the idea of retail and airport.
But what you're talking about literally equates to a wholesale change of mindset and application from the airports.
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of it can be retrofitted. We're working on, as I said, a few greenfield airports that we're thinking about this from first principles. How do you design a terminal with this in mind? And of course, as I mentioned in my presentation, we've got the complications of airports with the process journey and the holding journey and how we integrate those, and that's got to be very well considered in the master plan. But yeah, I think it's possible, and I think we've got to have an open mind. And I agree with you. We've got to find the evidence, and we've got to trial, and we've got to see how it's going to work. But what I think I am pretty sure of is in the next, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years, this is not going to be a kind of an unusual conversation.
It'll be part of the package.
I think we're going to be thinking about this, and I think I'm speculating, I don't know for certain, but I think the demand and the catalyst for the conversation is going to come from brands.
But indeed, I mean, brands have that dynamic, and they're far more aggressively interested than airports in real terms. But the thing is that when it comes to airports, they can act now if they so chose. They could actually co-opt the resources you're talking about now and enable a difference.
Yeah, they can. And I know a few that are. And also I would add, not only will the push come from brands, but I think the push will come from, and we're seeing the trend, less and less engagement from customers, and the realization that one of the reasons customers are, and I'm generalizing, generally not engaging, particularly when compared to the PAC's growth, is I think a lot of customers find airport retail somewhat predictable.
It's samey and overpriced.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that's unique to airports. Let me tell you, many shopping centres around the world are finding it challenging. We work on retail assets, not just shopping centres, but retail assets throughout the world, and on average, we've noticed and seen and experienced 20 to 30% vacancy rates. I am absolutely certain that that 30% vacancy will not be replaced by retail. And a lot of the shopping centres we're working in, we're replacing those vacancies with culture, with healthcare, with workplace, and other kind of activities and offers. And that is mainly around shifting the rhythm of the shopping centre from a shopping rhythm to a community rhythm, create community. And we often at Portland sit there and talk about this, and how do we then reflect that on airports? How does that begin to mirror in airports? And virtually everything we do outside airports, in the work we do at Portland, we always say, how would that work in an airport? Because our core are airports. And I think the way that can be translated from a shopping rhythm to a community rhythm in an airport is that I think the future, and again, I can't be certain, but here's a provocation maybe. The future of airport commercial is not a shopping centre model. I think it should be less and less like a shopping centre and more like a town square. And I think that, if you take just that term and look at it through that prism, that opens up a very interesting
It screams
conversation.
community, doesn't it?
Yeah. In a different way, not a community in a high street, but in a different sense. A communities of interest, communities of common interest around brands. I think that's quite interesting. So if we stop thinking about the IDL as a shopping centre and start thinking about it as a town square, it immediately shifts your mindset. How can we really rethink this? And I think that is what I'm very excited about.
So, if you had three things you wanted to communicate to the industry right now, what would they be?
Let's start from the macro, and I think it comes back to the point we made at the beginning, and that is ideas and innovation, embed them, imbue the business in its culture. So I imbue ideas and innovation in the culture of the business. It doesn't just come from the top. It doesn't just come from someone who's got the job description. I think that's the first thing. The second one is think about a terminal design as a programmable space, in terms of commercial, as a programmable space that is less and less about siloed categories, where whether it's P&C or liquor or confectionery, by and large, the environment is the same, because the emotional response in a consumer for confectionery and for P&C and for liquor and for fashion is very, very different. And that's where department stores have failed. That's where department stores are challenged throughout the world, because they didn't understand the difference in the experience of those categories. And I think we need to move away from a category approach to creating universes, a confectionery universe, a P&C universe that is very different. And I think if we can think about that, because it's a response to how people, emotional connection to those type of categories and the brands within them vary. And I think if we can do that, therefore change the pace of the terminal experience, I think that would be great. And I think the third thing is, beyond all the normal, narrative in the industry, how the Trinity must work together and data sharing. We know all that. I don't want to go over that again. We all talk about that, of course. But I think bringing in new skills, bringing in new people with different backgrounds that can deliver this this approach that has deep insight into, and I call them our audience because they're not all consumers, they're citizens first. Deep insight, ethnographic research processes, and not just surveys, to create this deep connection to our audience, to understand what's motivating them, and to gain insight from deep cultural trends that allow us to shift from, and this is the most important thing, if you're going to answer your question directly, the most important shift or change is shift from a business that does what used to be a great thing as a retail business, find out what your customers want and respond, being a responsive business, to being a predictive business. And the only way to be predictive is to create and deliver deep insight from research and cultural trends.
Ibrahim, I can safely say this interview is longer than your speech this morning, and we're all the better for it. Many thanks indeed for your time.
Thank you, Peter. It's always a pleasure.